I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel, would be my main piece of advice to anyone thinking about starting a company. Just look at what is being done and could be done better. And I think people overcomplicate business. When you think about business, really you need, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you really have to learn early how to do one of two things. So either learn how to...
Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Hidden Blueprint. Today we're incredibly excited to welcome Callum Woodcock, the CEO and founder of WineFi. Callum transitioned from a successful career in finance at JP Morgan to founding WineFi, a company that makes investing in fine wine as easy as buying an index fund. If you're an aspiring entrepreneur looking to make bold career choices, then this is a must watch. This is the blueprint of Callum Woodcock. Callum, your career began in traditional finance with roles at Fidelity and JP Morgan. What initially drew you to that path, and at what point did you realize you wanted to pivot from finance to entrepreneurship?
It's a very, very good question. So I will provide you, I'll do a tiny bit more context. So I did my undergrad at Bristol, and I got to third year. I was studying history. And the issue with history is it's a very kind of open-ended degree. So you can get to your third year and basically go, well, there's multiple things that I could do with this. It's not really a fixed path like studying law or, even something like economics, would necessarily lead. It doesn't necessarily lead in a certain direction. So I always had an inkling that I wanted to be a founder. In fact, I was always convinced that I would be a founder, but I didn't really have a time frame on it at the time. And I think when I got to my final year at university, I was looking around at the people I regarded as most impressive within my peer group. And it seemed like the vast majority of them were going on to financial grad schemes. So whether that was at BlackRock or JP Morgan or Goldman's or Fidelity, whatever it might be. So I started applying in that direction just because it seemed like that was what the people that I regarded as kind of players in my year group were doing, which is a very pathetic reason to choose a certain career, but I think a lot of people end up going down the same sort of path. At the same time, there was a little bit of logic there. So when I was 17, I read a Robert Kiyosaki book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which will be familiar to many of your audience, which is kind of a primer on investing and entrepreneurship more generally. And one of the points that he makes in that book is if you want to be an entrepreneur, you really have to learn early how to do one of two things. So either learn how to build, by which he means learn how to code. And I was never going to be a developer. I was never going to be an engineer, or learn how to sell. And I thought, okay, if I can get myself onto a sales grad scheme, I could do that for a few years and then come off the back of it, with a sales related skill set that means it should be a breeze starting a company. Obviously, it's never quite that simple, but that was the logic for why I started in finance. And I think when you look at, as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, the difference between salaries for a sales grad scheme at a financial services company, particularly an investment company like Fidelity, and another very impressive FMCG type company like a Procter and Gamble, is pretty extensive. So I imagine there was a bit of that at the back of my mind as well at that age, but really it was because I saw what my peers were doing, and I thought, wow, if I can join an organization, learn how to sell, it'll set me up to be a founder.
Do you think that's maybe an issue in the modern day with a lot of young people feeling pressure, not only from friends, university, but parents as well, sort of these traditional career routes that they would have known growing up? And that when you see everyone's, applying for spring weeks, applying for summer internships, do you feel young people can somewhat get pushed in a direction maybe that they're not too informed on and actually wouldn't necessarily be the most rewarding for themselves?
I definitely think so. I think there's a balance to be struck because ultimately, at 21 or 22, you are an adult. It is your decision ultimately to go that route. However, at 21 or 22, you haven't yet had the experience to know what you want and don't want, or what you like and don't like. I think I had a sense that a big company was never going to be right for me. I knew I wanted to be a founder. I knew that meant starting a company and growing it from the ground up. But I think that if you are kind of coached throughout your entire academic life, let's face it, we go to school at age 6 or whatever, and you don't really leave those institutions, if you choose to go to university, until you are 22. And up until that age, the hoops that you've had to jump through have been very clearly structured for you. You know that you have to study for certain tests, you've got the mark scheme, you know what they're looking for. And actually, I think in many ways, what makes the grad scheme route appealing to young people is not just the fact that it's a logo on the CV, it's probably what their parents are familiar with, but it's also that grad schemes are basically an extension of that structure that you're already following. You end up you end up applying for grad schemes, and you work out very quickly that it is a bit of a game, because let's face it, whilst grads might have some things that make them stand out, they may have done spring weeks, they may have got relevant work experience, etc. Broadly, the top 10% of profiles all look the same. Everyone's got their gold Duke of Edinburgh badges. Everyone's done work experience in a relevant sector. Everyone's done maybe an internship in their second year. So I think that, I learned very quickly when I was applying to grad schemes what worked and what didn't. And I suspect that that's the same for a lot of people. And there is a sense of comfort and familiarity, I think, in the whole process of applying to a big company. And actually, maybe even once you're within that company, the whole promotion structure that a big company naturally needs to cultivate. For people that have kind of become institutionalized by going through the academic system, it is almost a natural extension of that. So I completely think that people, I think railroaded is the wrong term, because I chose to do it. I didn't know that you could join a startup, and I certainly wasn't ready to start a company at that age. So it just seemed to me to be like the natural progression of what I was already doing. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but there is almost like an expectation that if you go to a Russell Group university, you will get onto a grad scheme as long as you work hard. And I think that can be, I think certainly in my case, it can be a very dangerous thing, because you end up sleepwalking into a life that, in my case, was completely wrong for what I wanted to do, and really meant that I was directionally, going in the wrong direction.
I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the structure there and how you knew for yourself that it maybe wasn't the right path. I mean, I remember one of our previous guests told me that there's no greater drug than a salary. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, once you're in there and you've got the salary coming in on a monthly basis, what gave you that courage to break free and go and start your own thing?
So I actually think I was quite tactical about it. So for me, there was never a period where I wasn't earning. So I was paid a salary when I was at Fidelity and at JP Morgan. I was paid a salary at the startup that I joined as commercial director. And I was very lucky that my former boss, so the CEO of a company called Nomio, allowed me to fundraise effectively for what would become WineFi whilst still in situ at Nomio. So we kind of had this agreement that I would continue working hard. I would help hire my replacement, but in exchange, I would be, able to fundraise. So we had pretty much completed the fundraise by the time I finally went full time, and I stepped really from the salary that I was being paid at that particular company into, admittedly, a much lower founders type salary at WineFi. But I think that is not the case for a lot of people. I think for a lot of people, the scariest thing is going from being in employment and having a salary to not having an income in the early months while you build a business. But you don't have to do that. You can start a business as a side project and choose to go full time when you've reached a certain revenue target. You don't have to, you know, sacrifice your savings even. And in fact, I read a book by a British entrepreneur called Felix Dennis, where his point was the one time that he tried to use his own money to start a company, which really flies in the face of what you hear a lot about entrepreneurship. The one time that he tried to use his own cash to start a company, he realized that the reason that he was doing it was kind of out of ego and because he thought it was a brilliant idea. And actually, if it was a good enough idea, someone else would have given him money to start it. And so I really internalized that when I decided to raise capital. There was certainly a winner takes all opportunity that we had to move quickly on, but there was also a sense of, well, this almost tests the validity of this concept. And what was very interesting is many of our early angel investors went on to become investors through WineFi in the wine. So it was almost validating the concept as we were going. So your salary absolutely can be a drug, but there was never any part of me that was going to remain in employment indefinitely. And I think that if you are an entrepreneur, people talk about golden handcuffs, how you're earning really good money, you've got used to a certain lifestyle, so it's difficult to step away. And maybe if you've got children and certain other responsibilities, that is true, and it does make it harder. But I'm 30, I don't have kids yet, and I just thought, well, this is the youngest I'm ever going to be. I have, a mortgage to pay, except I have comparatively fewer responsibilities than I will at 40. It's now or never.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the concept about validating the idea from an early stage. And I do want to actually go into a little bit more about WineFi. It's an incredibly unique concept. Would you be able to explain it a little bit for the audience and actually tell us about the moment where you spotted the opportunity?
Yeah, sure. So without pitching the business too aggressively, I think to understand Wineify and why we're doing what we're doing, you really need to understand wine as an asset class. So for the uninitiated, fine wine is an alternative asset. It sits within this broader bucket that's often referred to as collectibles. So that's things like artwork, whiskey, watches, classic cars, you name it. But the difference between wine and all of those other asset classes is that there is an objective third party market price. So it's a lot like residential property in that you can have an estimate for what for what a certain wine is worth. And what that allows you to do is to run, detailed quant analysis over the 22 years of data that we have to understand how prices have changed, what factors have influenced those changes in pricing, and try and make predictions for how those prices are going to behave in the future. So I remember looking at that when I was at JP Morgan and thinking, oh, that's really interesting that wine has these characteristics, because it's almost like, it's not as, the pricing isn't as real time as the equity markets are, for example, but it does have this kind of price factor where if you were buying a painting or even a bottle of rare whiskey, it's really only worth what the broker that is selling it to you has estimated it's worth. So you have these point in time valuations rather than real time valuations. But at the same time, wine has these fascinating characteristics as an asset class. So it offers better risk-adjusted returns over every time horizon than the S&P 500, the FTSE 100, mainstream commodities and bond indices, gold. It's really kind of interesting characteristics, and it's uncorrelated to those asset classes, so it's a great diversifier. And then the big thing for UK investors, particularly, we're recording this days before Labour announce the new budget, where capital gains tax is rumoured to be increased. Wine is exempt from capital gains tax. So when I first had a tiny bit of money behind me, in my mid-20s, I thought, great, I'm going to build a wine portfolio. And I think I had 10 grand or something to invest. And I remember going to one of the wine merchants, and I basically said, look, I never want to drink this. I want to treat it purely as an investment. There's no way that I could justify spending 10K on wine that I'm planning on drinking. What would you recommend I invest in? And the first question they asked me was, what do you like to drink? And the whole kind of argument was, well, if it doesn't go up in value, you can always drink it, which I get. But as an investor, that really scared me off. There needed to be a clearer line between collecting, which is ultimately for pleasure, and investing, which is obviously for anticipated financial gain. And I just thought, okay, I'm not sure there's a solution here. And then I also had a couple of conversations with wine investment businesses. And coming from a professional asset manager like Fidelity and JP Morgan, I was really put off by basically the unprofessionalism of these businesses. Wine isn't regulated, and that can sometimes attract certain sales tactics, very kind of boiler room sales tactics. I felt like there were huge gaps in my knowledge at the time and the knowledge of the individual that was trying to sell me these wines. And I just found the whole experience quite off-putting. So I did end up actually investing through a merchant, but I was kind of unhappy with the experience. So I started thinking about, how can this asset class become more mainstream? There must be other people like me that want exposure to the asset class without necessarily the cost of owning the wine outright themselves. And really, WineFi came from the realization that you could put a structure around this, effectively a tax transparent structure that allows investors to gain exposure to the wine markets at a fraction of the cost of owning the individual assets outright. And the ultimate aim, and this will be the case by December, is that people will be able to sign up to the platform and buy into a syndicate as easily as they could place a trade on Robinhood or Free Trade. There have been some attempts to create trading platforms for individual wines, but the issue with that is even if you're seriously into wine, chances are you're not going to know which wines are likely to appreciate in value. So you need that layer of professional expertise on top. And we combine cutting edge data science, so some pretty hardcore quant analysis, with the expertise of our veteran investment committee. Our investment committee lead has invested 85 million plus into wine over the course of a 30-year career. And in that way, we combine both the vehicle that allows people to gain cost-effective exposure with the expertise required to select, source, and manage wines that have the potential to outperform.
No, I mean, that's incredibly fascinating. It's something that, I mean, me personally, I didn't know prior. And as I mentioned before, obviously an incredibly unique idea. And I think it leads quite well onto my next question because a lot of young aspiring entrepreneurs out there, they know they want to start a business. They maybe had that same feeling that you did, knowing that I don't want to be stuck in a structured environment in employment for my entire life. But they maybe lack one important aspect, the idea. What would you maybe say to people out there who want to start their own business, but they don't seem to have an idea that they can try and capitalize off the back of and launch into their startup?
So I have a very strong opinion of this, and this has really been born out of me living through that for years. So I left university, and genuinely from the day I started working on a grad scheme, I was just thinking about what company I should start. Um, and I went through various different ideas as everyone does. One I took to revenue while I was still working full time. It started as a side hustle. In hindsight, I could have raised money for it and gone full time on that project, but at the time I didn't really have the skill set or the confidence to do so. So the first thing that I would say is I think every single entrepreneur, or at this stage you're a kind of a wantrepreneur, you want to have a business, but you don't really know where to start, has the, and you may even have done this yourself. You don't have to say on the pod, but it wouldn't surprise me if you had, where you come up with the bare bones of a concept, and you think this is a fantastic idea, whatever it might be. Uh, is there anything else out there like this? You buy the domain name, and Alex Hormozy refers to this as the unrealistic optimism stage. You haven't done enough research. You've got this kind of vague concept that you think could be something, and you're really excited about it because it's new and it's shiny and it's going to change the world. And you've bought the domain name, and the domain name's perfect. And then you start looking into it in more detail, and that's inevitably where the issues arise, right? So maybe it's been done before, maybe for regulatory reasons or legal reasons or cash flow reasons. It's a very complicated business to start. Maybe operationally it's too difficult, and you start to encounter all of these different challenges, and you then enter the kind of next phase of that curve, which is like the downhill curve, that Hormozy refers to as realistic pessimism. You've recognized all of the ways that this idea wasn't that kind of perfect shiny object that you thought it was at the beginning. And most people give up at that stage because they either don't want to change the idea, they've become kind of married to the platonic ideal of their idea. Well, if I can't do it, if I can't do my original vision, then I don't want to do it at all. Or they just think, actually, this is a hell of a lot of work. I may as well just go back to my day job and forget about it. And people can live that same cycle, and I did, over and over and over again. You can live the same 6 to 12 months over and over and over again, unless you end up pushing through the that realistic pessimism curve, and then you get, of course, to realistic optimism. So you understand what is possible, you understand how your idea would have to look in order to be a viable business. And what people don't say is everyone loves talking about light bulb moments because it makes for a sexy story. With the narrative that I tell about WineFi is true. All the problems that we identified was accurate, but the original iteration of WineFi was fractionalization, make the fractions tradable on a blockchain. And I found out very quickly, well, actually not very quickly, after I'd spent several £1,000s with lawyers, that the regulatory challenges were too great. The technology was there, but the kind of the legal infrastructure wasn't, both in the UK but also in Europe and the US. And we ended up moving to a solution that still solves the original problem, but is very different from the original idea. So I think the first thing is, if you have an idea that you're exploring, don't be disheartened when that happens. Recognize that it's an important part of the process. And I don't know a single entrepreneur whose business is the original version of what they envisioned, because inevitably you have to evolve it. And the second thing is, if you haven't got an idea, people talk about solving problems. I would actually go one step further. I knew that people wanted to invest in wine. There was already a product market fit thing there already. There were wine investment companies out there. They just weren't doing it very well. They weren't using data in the right way. They didn't have the right people involved. Their kind of biz ops practices were just not fit for purpose. And I experienced that because I was trying to invest through them. But at the same time, people wanted to invest in wine. We knew that the audience was there. And so the jump from that to people want to invest in wine without having the optionality of taking the wine out of bond and drinking it themselves, should they so choose, which is effectively what our model does. But in exchange, they can enter at a much lower cost. I was like, well, I'm the target audience for that product. And I know that other people will be as a result. I can't be the only person that's interested in this. And so I think a lot of entrepreneurs feel like they need to come up with the next great idea. But then no idea is original. Even the ones that seem original are not original. The nichest AI company now that is starting will have based a lot of the work that they are doing on the progress that another company has made. I promise you that. So I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel, would be my main piece of advice to anyone thinking about starting a company. Just look at what is being done and could be done better. It doesn't have to be completely transformational. I mean, look at a business like Seed Legals. It's fantastic. We use them for our pre-seed round, set up by a chap called Anthony Rose. And basically it provides startups with all of the legal infrastructure they need to raise money, hire employees, that kind of thing. So it's contracts, effectively. There are dozens and dozens of law firms out there offering exactly that service. But what Seed Legals did was productize it to make it super easy to sign up and use. It allowed entrepreneurs to self-serve on all of these documents rather than have their lawyers send them over. It allowed teams to collaborate, put a shiny interface on it to make it kind of a joy to use. And as a result, they captured an enormous amount of the UK's startup land market share, because everyone went, oh yeah, we just use Seed Legals. They're cheap, they're good, and they're really easy to get started with. But their whole thing was about the way that they presented that offering as opposed to the offering itself. And I think that that's something that anyone can do. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
100%. I mean, it's fantastic to sort of draw upon Seed Legal as an example. Obviously, some of our audience may not know, but it's you never have to reinvent the wheel, as you mentioned. But I did want to ask you about, in your case with WineFi, even though you don't necessarily have to create these really innovative new solutions to new problems, as you mentioned, you can build upon a lot of what other people have done. It does still somewhat require industry knowledge of some sort. With WineFi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine your experiences at JP Morgan and Fidelity would have actually been incredibly useful, and maybe without them, I mean, you can tell me, without them, do you think you would have been able to launch WineFi?
So I don't. I would have launched something, but I don't think it would have been an asset management related business. And, actually, whilst I say, I think starting in a big corp was probably the wrong decision, it did teach me, one, how to position investment products, but it also made me understand what, at the reverse of that is what buyers are looking for in an investment product and how people make decisions about investment products. And, with wine, I was very aware that it's an esoteric asset class. It's an asset class where very few people have the knowledge required to actually invest effectively in it. And so how do you reassure investors that that this is a a sensible investment for them? And obviously a lot of that is personal and looking at their own portfolios, but a big part of it is around education, and in particular producing professional investment material that allows investors to compare apples to apples. So allows investors to compare the Live X 1000, which is the broadest measure of investment grade wine, to the S&P 500, and allows them to compare different volatility profiles, Sharpe ratios, whatever it might be. And I think that definitely helped with this concept, because a lot of it's around positioning. And when you take that argument, so all of our syndicates that we launch, for example, will have an investment overview that will kind of run through the region and then wine as an asset class more broadly. so investors get an understanding of the benefits and the risks of a product like that. If you compare that to your classic wine merchant, where the argument for investing in a wine is that the guy's worked there for 20 years and he's sure it will go up in value. There is no comparison. And that latter argument works if someone is kind of ambivalent as to whether it increases in value or whether they uncork it and drink it. And they're probably hoping in a way that it doesn't, so they can justify, drinking a very expensive bottle of wine. To someone that is only interested in wine as an asset class, then it really is night and day. And I think we've been able to grow as quickly as we've been able to grow, bypassing seven figures in revenue well within our first year, because we've tapped into an audience that would not have traditionally invested in wine because they didn't understand it. Maybe they were wine drinkers, but most wine drinkers are satisfied drinking good wine at the best possible price. It's you might love, I love South African wine, or that's a bad example because you kind of can invest in South African wine, but I love Chilean wine. You wouldn't really typically have Chilean wine in a portfolio. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one. But again, this has been a long-winded answer to your question, which was whether you thought I could have started this particular company had I not come from an asset management background. And I think I would not have had the understanding of how to position a business like this had I not come from asset management.
Callum, you mentioned a little bit there about the wine industry and being able to invest in wines. Maybe a little bit previously was a little bit gatekept, whereas if you're not directly inside of the business and you don't understand how everything operates, it's incredibly difficult to get in. Now, something that I think was very similar to that for the longest time was entrepreneurship more generally. The
Mm-hmm.
availability of information for young aspiring entrepreneurs throughout the years has been fairly difficult to actually access. I mean, you have the amazing stories about the Elon Musks, about the Zuckerbergs, all of these different entrepreneurs. But you mentioned Alex Hormozy, someone who I've personally watched, and I'm sure a lot of the audience will as well. What would you say for young aspiring entrepreneurs out there? How can they take advantage of people like Alex Hormozy and take advantage of all the information that is now out there to support people in launching and scaling their first startup?
So the first thing I would say is do not use it as an excuse to procrastinate, which is what I did for 6 to 7 years. I've read every book on entrepreneurship under the sun. I've done courses, I've listened to podcasts, but ultimately you have to remember that you do need to do the work. And I think people overcomplicate business. When you think about business, really you need a product and you need a way of distributing that product to an audience, and everything else is just the operations that tie the two together. And so I think that you can spend a lot of time learning rather than doing. And actually, the only way to learn properly is to do. I learned more in my first 6 months of starting a company than I had in 6 years reading around the subject. And that's a very painful thing to realize in hindsight. But again, it comes down to the fact that you're trained to do that. You come from age 6 to 22, you're in an academic environment. So it's very easy to fall back on studying as opposed to actually doing. In terms of resources, I think we are incredibly lucky that we have the internet. I know that sounds really obvious, but I recently read James Dyson's autobiography. So obviously the entrepreneur that founded the synonymous Hoover Company. And he's a really, really interesting entrepreneur. But what really comes across is he's starting a business in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in the early part of that, there is no venture capital. It's very difficult to get a loan for a new business because you haven't got any income. The challenges that you had to go to get anything off the ground, you had to go through. There's no internet. Your distribution channels are seriously limited because he was trying to sell a wheelbarrow, and he talks about going from garden centre to garden centre up and down the country himself to try and sell this new type of wheelbarrow. And so I think we are in this, we're incredibly lucky to live in the information age where it has never been easier, one, to actually, get your hands on resources that can literally give you a step-by-step playbook on how to start a business, but also on, the tools that we have now. I mean, I don't know if your audience are familiar with something like Replit, for example, replit.ai, but it's a natural language app that allows you to literally create applications. We used it to build an app the other day that we use internally just through natural language prompts. It is incredible. No generation in history has ever had access to these kind of, not just the knowledge, but also the actual practical tools needed to build a business from the ground up. And we were talking. I was at a founder summit the other day, and we were talking about how there will be $1 billion one-man company. That's just the way that this ecosystem is going. And then the other thing that I love, just before I get into the actual practical resources, was there's a guy called Daniel Priestley, who is a well-known Australian entrepreneur, but is based in the UK. And I saw him on a podcast recently, and he talks about how I'm 30. He talks about how our parents' generation got cheap property. That was their big win, or they got free education, and their parents generation got cheap property, and so on and so on. And that we didn't get any of that. But what we have got is the ability to build businesses in a way that no other generation has before. And I think that that's a really empowering thought. So piece of advice would be, do and learn while doing. Don't procrastinate. Don't feel like just try and build something and then figure out how to monetize it or whatever if you're starting out from absolute scratch. And then when it comes down to reading around a subject or trying to get resources, what I found is the best strategy for moving forwards as quickly as possible is to seek out resources relating to whatever problem you're trying to tackle, rather than just broad resources related to starting a business, because there is no one right way to start a business. You need to go to market quickly, you need to test different things, you need to iterate. But the framework that we use at WineFi is we identify whatever we see to be the bottleneck. So one day it might be our ads aren't performing as we want them to anymore, and therefore you should seek out resources relating to how to make ads perform better. Bad example. But if you approach it in that way, then you keep moving forwards without using learning as a way of procrastinating.
100%. And I like the idea of the bottleneck as well. I think very relevant to what you're doing. But I did want to touch a little bit upon, again, you say learn by doing. I want to take you back, Callum, back to university. You decide you're not going to go and do a graduate job. You decide you're going to launch a startup and you're just going to learn as much as you can by actually going and pursuing it. At this point, you don't have an idea, you don't have the experience within an industry to try and launch something off the back of it. What would you say for a young entrepreneur in that position, or for a young Callum, aspiring Callum, to do in that situation? What would you start? What would you try and build just with the available information that you would have at your disposal?
So I think, number one, I think that's a great age to do it. And I think people don't really realize how optimal an age is to do it. If the best time to start a business is when you're living at home and you haven't got any expenses, because you can afford to take risks. The best time to do it in hindsight would have been at university for that exact reason, or ideally before university. But I think I was having too much fun as a teenager to do that. So I think the first thing is recognize that you have a golden window of opportunity at that sort of age. And then in terms of the business that I would start, really, because you're still in the understanding how a business fits together mode effectively, I think you need to start from the basics. And ultimately a business is something that is a product or service, whatever, that someone else will pay you for. So I think you need to think, what is the simplest thing that I can use? What is the simplest kind of service or product? It should probably be a service business because they're the cheapest to start. What service can I provide that people would pay me for? And it doesn't have to be something complicated, but I remember the feeling. So I ran a business where effectively the idea was to match coaches with employees. And it was a B2B company. I started it while in full-time employment, which is, a tricky way of doing it. But I remember getting my first contract signed by a company, and I've still got that contract because it was the first time that someone had paid me for something that was my own creation. I at that point sold many millions in sales at JPM, but that was their product. I was just the way. I was just the distribution. I was the person selling it. And there is no feeling where you've created something and someone has paid you for it. And I think once you have that first contract, your confidence massively goes up because you effectively go, wow, if I could get one sale, then it's feasible that I could get two. And if I could get two, then obviously I can get five. And then I'll continue making the proposition and the marketing better, and then I could probably get to 10. and then suddenly you've actually got this viable business. So I think, okay, how would I approach it? So you haven't got any cash. Let's say that, okay? You've got maybe 100 quid so you could buy a domain name and a website. I would think about the kind of skill sets that I had. So, let's say you are especially good at, I don't know, content editing, talking about a podcast. That would be an obvious place to start because it's a skill set that you have that other people want. And then it's about, okay, how can you start winning clients for that particular service? So let's say I'm going to use a podcast as an example. Let's say you offer podcast editing services and you're willing to chop up a podcast into lots of different clips that can be, you sent out on social media at different times. A very, very simple company to start. It's a saturated market. It's pretty commoditized. I would approach podcast creators like yourself with that particular business model in mind and basically say, I will do this for you for free. All I ask is that you leave me a testimonial on my Trustpilot page that I can then use at a later date. And I would do that for 5 different people. And then I would go back to those people, one, to see whether they wanted me to work with them on an ongoing basis. And hopefully you'd expect like 1 or 2 of them, if the service has been good, would want to. But then you have a ton of proof points that you could then use to drive cold outbound. So go on LinkedIn, start posting about what you're doing, start building rapport with people. And I think the key focus is that you only need to win 1 paying client. If you look too far ahead into the future with any business, you procrastinate because the fog of war is so dense. It's almost impossible to see how you're going to get through it. But if you focus on, and we did this at WineFi, 1 client and then 2 clients, and then suddenly you're at 10 clients, and then 50 clients, and then before you know it, you're cash flow positive, and you're closing 100 clients a month. And you kind of go, wow, I can't believe we're here. But it doesn't feel like you've come a long way because you've lived through each step of it. It feels like natural progression to you. But you don't have, at the start of an entrepreneurial journey, you don't have the ability to pattern match because you've never done it before. And I'd never done it before. So you therefore have to build up that skill set. So I would say, work for free, get five testimonials. That will give you confidence then to go and ask people. And you have to do the work, by the way. You can't just ask for a testimonial and not do the work because you won't have that internal proof point. And I found that with another business that I was building. It was really interesting. And then that will give you the confidence to ask for money because you're like, look, I've done this for 5 people. They've all said it's really good. That will give you the confidence to ask for money. And then you'll get rejected a few times, but you will eventually close 1 client. And then your brain goes, okay, this worked, this didn't, but I've got this 1 client. And then as a result, it's much easier then to go and close 10 and 20 and 30. And before you know it, you've got a fully fledged business. So I guess that would be my approach. I think people overcomplicate it because we're told that startups are these, like everyone, when you think of a startup, you think of like a really, really cool tech idea. That's just one type of startup. You can start companies very, very inexpensively and roll them into big organizations. I mean, look at Chris Donnelly. So his younger brother's a friend of mine. They together started a company called Lottie, which is a platform that matches care seekers, so older people with care homes. Fantastic business. They've raised from some of the biggest names in venture capital. It's absolutely flying. But Chris, his older brother, started effectively a marketing agency from his university bedroom in Warwick, and sold it 10 years later for 8 figures before starting Lottie, which is this kind of super cool, innovative, change the world tech company. But the first business you start doesn't necessarily have to be the one that you work in for the rest of your life. It's just about making that start.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned risk a little bit earlier, which I wanted to touch on a little bit more, Callum. What's the biggest risk you've taken in your life?
Biggest risk I've taken in my life? That's a really, really interesting question. I remember the scariest moment, which maybe then translates through to risk. But I remember handing in my notice at JPM, not really knowing what I was doing. I knew I was in the wrong environment because I just didn't understand how a business fitted together, and I never would have understood it properly had I been at an organization of that size. But at the same time, it carries a lot of cachet having that logo on the CV. It's not the type of role that you can walk back into once you'd resigned. I was the youngest ever associate within the UK funds team. So a lot of people, colleagues, my friends, basically were like, "You're nuts. I don't know what you're doing. Tough it out for a few more years, and then you'll have made money and you'll be able to go and do whatever you want." And I remember being like, "I'm so miserable because I felt like I felt like I was moving in the wrong direction to where I wanted to be, and that's a really painful place to be. I knew I had to get out of there, and I remember, I was starting work at a scale up, but I still felt completely lost because I was like, how, this is a smaller company, but how am I gonna work out how this business fits together? While I was doing it, I was doing a part-time master's at Cambridge in business and entrepreneurship because I was trying to understand the ecosystem a little bit better. And I remember just being on a train actually on the way to Cambridge to start that course and thinking, have I made a colossal mistake? Because you don't have any proof points at that point with yourself. So it felt like I had just jumped into the unknown, and I felt unbelievably lost for a few years, really until I started working as the commercial director at that scale up and then founding WineFi. But I felt like it was like I hadn't committed to either side. I hadn't committed to a corporate career where I'd be unfulfilled, but I'd have a great logo on my CV, or I hadn't committed fully to being a founder because I wasn't full time on a company. Um, and I think that was probably the most that I've ever bet on myself because I was basically going, am I going to end up trapped in this kind of half life where I'm not working at a big company and nor am I following my dreams. I'm just kind of stuck on this kind of mediocre middle path. Or am I going to succeed? And I remember that being a very scary place to be at the time. But I don't know if risk is the right word. I've never bet the house on anything. I'm it sounds strange because I'm running a company, but I am relatively risk averse, or I think if I take risk, it's calculated risk. Um, the payoff has to outweigh the risk. I wouldn't put, I'm engaged. I wouldn't put my fiance in a position where, there was a risk that we could lose the house, for example, over a decision that I'd made. And I think that if you structure a business appropriately, you don't necessarily need to take those sort of risks. There's always people out there that will give you money if the idea is good enough.
I want to go a little bit more into quitting at JP Morgan, as you said, not necessarily maybe as the most risky, but as a very scary moment for you personally. How did you balance that at the time? How were your support systems helping you? And in fact, you actually mentioned that everyone was sort of telling you, "What are you doing? You're crazy."
Mm.
What toll did that take on you mentally at the time?
So I think I was very lucky that my dad's an entrepreneur. He has built and sold several businesses. And my fiance was very supportive because she knew that that's what I wanted to do, and I think she saw firsthand how trapped I felt. Um, but I think pretty much everyone else thought I was nuts. And I've spoken to other entrepreneurs about this who have come from similar backgrounds, similar corporate backgrounds, who have left McKinsey or Goldman's or wherever it might be, but somewhere with a big logo. And until their startup is doing well, they are looked down upon a little bit and talked about. Oh, I can't believe that Josh has thrown in the towel at this particular company. Oh, I can't believe Callum's given up JP Morgan to go and pursue this weird little wine thing. And it's inevitably one of those things that until your business starts working, it's very easy for people to kind of dismiss what you're doing. So my support systems, I think the ones that really mattered to me were there, but pretty much every other one wasn't. Including, I remember my fiance's brothers being quite puzzled about why I'd left JP Morgan, and one of them was like, "Oh, were you fired?" And I just because they couldn't comprehend leaving a job like that. And it was a real crossing the Rubicon moment for me because I knew that I couldn't then go back into a big corp job. I was off that career path. And I think that's where, when you talk about risk, that's where that thought came from. It was one of those burning the boats, no turning back type situations. But I think, the main thing is I was lucky to have the support of my parents, lucky to have the support of my fiance. And interestingly, thinking about Alice, my fiance, there was never any doubt in her mind that I was going to start a business, whereas there was doubt in mine, um, which is interesting because sometimes you need that outside perspective, I think, to really kind of yeah, make certain decisions.
I mean, certainly looking back at it now with the success that you've had with WineFi, I think you seem a lot more justified in your decision making again. But hindsight is a fantastic thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did want to.
exactly.
I imagine there are people there be like, "Oh, always knew you would do it, mate. Always knew you could make it." After you've done it, but at the time probably would have been thinking something very differently. I did want to take a little bit of a pivot though in the conversation. You are, relatively speaking, a very young entrepreneur who's achieved quite a lot at such a young age. What is the biggest misconception when it comes to being a young entrepreneur?
Biggest misconception. Um, I don't know. So, okay, let me give you an example. So, I was at a founders summit a couple of weeks ago, and I met an extraordinary entrepreneur who I think was 25 at the time. And I remember being 25 and trying to start a company and thinking I'm too young. People aren't taking me seriously enough. I was trying to sell a B2B product. And then I met this guy, and it just made me think, no, I wasn't too young. I just hadn't done the work. He'd started a business when he was 18, and I didn't even try and start one until I was about 24. So he was effectively 6 years ahead of, he'd done 6 years of learning and doing by the time that I tried to start a business. And, when I was 24, that was my first year of trying to start a company. And I think that really made me recognize that it's not really an age thing. It's much more of an experience thing. And I think, there's a really interesting stat that I think the average age of a founder in the UK when they found their first company is 45. And, Gary Vee and entrepreneurs like that, it's always that refrain of it's never too late. And of course it's never too late. Everyone knows Colonel Sanders founded KFC at age 60 or whatever it is. But ultimately business is about pattern matching, and it's about reps, and it's about understanding how certain things are done. So when certain situations arise, you don't panic. Oh, revenue's down this month. Revenue is not, it's not some like nebulous thing. You've got certain growth levers that you can pull to increase revenue. Just because you've had a bad month doesn't mean that your business is over. But until you've had a few bad months and resolved those bad months and revenue's back on track, you don't know that that's, it's not a fatal thing. It's just a temporary scenario. And there are examples of that over and over and over again. The first time you get into a legal dispute, the first time that a supplier doesn't deliver what they want and runs off with your cash, it doesn't deliver what you want and runs off with the cash. Like, all of those things are things that will happen to you for a first time and can be really damaging, because you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this has happened. This is a terrible scenario. And I think the earlier that you can go through those experiences, the more robust you become, and as a result, the better an entrepreneur you become. So I actually think that the earlier you start, the better. And I think I could have saved myself a lot of heartbreak and pain by committing earlier. Had I started a business at 19 or 20 or 21 or 22, no matter how small that business was, I would have learned how to do something, even if it's something as simple as building a website or accepting payments. All of that is experience that can only really be learned by doing. And so I think the biggest misconception that people have about young entrepreneurs is that, you know, like you could start at any time. Of course you can start at any time, but you still have to do the work. And I think where being a relatively young entrepreneur, when I look at what I'm doing now, when I'm 35 or 40 or 50, how many more experiences will I have had that's kind of compounded the knowledge that I've already acquired? And how much would that have been compounded even more at 35 or 40 or 50 had I started at 20 rather than 24? So I think it's like, I feel like there's almost it's like a feel good culture that we have, where people go, oh, it's never too late. No, it's never too late, but it's also never too early. And you can set yourself up for success in a much more robust fashion by starting young. And I'm 30. It doesn't feel young to me. It feels relatively young, but it's not 21, which I can remember being. So I think that that's probably the biggest misconception, really.
I really like the bit where you talked about that young founder who you met, the 25-year-old, who, whilst being the same age as yourself, and when you look from the outside, you see two 25-year-olds, what you don't see is the experience behind it. And I think that's a very big misconception more generally. People see young people and they look up, they see these 45-year-olds, 55-year-olds, and we associate age with experience. In reality, experience is, as you said, the number of reps you actually do something. You can rack up quite a lot of experience in a very short period of time, by doing, very condensed, working evenings, working mornings, working weekends, etc., maybe while you're studying or even when you are employed. So, leading quite well into my next question, I feel like we live in a very big label culture. And what I mean by that is, I feel like people are always trying to label other people, saying, this is you, this is what you're able to do. And especially with young people, I feel like there's a very, I'm not going to say toxic, but there's definitely a culture in which everyone wants to put a label on someone else and says, this is what you are and this is what you're capable of doing. How can young people sort of break out of that and maybe prove to people a little bit older who say, why would I trust your company or why would I trust you to deliver these services when you're half my age and don't have the experience that I do?
Great question. So first of all, it comes down to self-belief. Most people don't get started because they think they can't do something or they shouldn't be asking someone for something. And even when they do start, they give up too early because they face a tiny bit of rejection that reaffirms what they already thought about themselves. And that's where, your question, which I thought was very interesting earlier about what kind of business would I start if I was a 22-year-old having just finished uni with no cash. Um, I started by saying, get those reviews first, even though you're working for free. And that's one, because it's a good way of marketing yourself. But the main reason is because it will show you that you can get people to, people want your stuff. And that changes the way that you look at, your relationship with other people and the value exchange, the value creation that you can provide. Um, so, I'm very much of the view that self-esteem is just your reputation with yourself. So I think, first and foremost, you need to know that what you're doing is good. And then it really becomes a matter of convincing other people. But other people are easier to convince than you would imagine. We the most permanent labels are the ones that we put on ourselves. If you keep telling people that you're an entrepreneur, people will believe that you're an entrepreneur. If you keep telling people that you are a wine investor or a whatever it might be, people just accept that label. So as long as you are competent and you're showing them that you can do what you say you can do and you're doing it to a higher standard, then I just don't think that that will be an issue no matter how young you look. It's all about the experience that you're delivering. Um, and then also, I don't think that we should forget that the world isn't fair. It's not about young people look young and as a result will be dismissed as not having enough experience in the same way that someone who's at kind of retirement age will be dismissed for being too old and not really understanding the game or whatever. There's always discrimination at some level that's happening, and maybe if you're a straight white male in late 40s early 50s when you're at your kind of peak earning career, maybe that is the pinnacle where you're sitting, you're in the hot seat, so to speak. But most people aren't in their late 40s early 50s. Only a tiny section of the population are. And I think that the more that the more that we can accept, like, yes, this is going to be tougher for me because I'm 22 or I'm 25 or I'm 30 or I'm whatever I might be. I think the sooner that we can get over it, like I think the damage comes from expectation. Expectation that life is fair, or that and of course it should be fair. Everyone should be equal, but it's not. Like, and it doesn't help anyone to pretend that it is. Like, it's kind of just self delusion. So if you do have to work a bit harder to be, as a younger person, in order to convince someone that you are, that you're someone that they should work with, or you're the supplier that they should choose, then do it, because that's what you need to do to start a company. And I know that's not a very like popular, inclusive thing to say, but everyone is going to face prejudice, no matter who they are. And I think that the only way to do that is to over deliver and, be so good that people have to sit up and take notice. So yeah, I'm not sure how kind of woke that comment is, but I think it's true. I think that, people, I find it a very empowering thought to go, yeah, okay, well, I'm terrible at this, or I'm terrible at that, or I've got this disadvantage or this disadvantage. Therefore, I have to work harder than other people that don't have those disadvantages in order to make up the difference.
I think, as you mentioned, the world isn't fair. Fundamentally, things should be. And that's great to say, things should be. But me personally, I'm a big believer in controlling what you can control. You can't control everything. things are not always going to be fair. We're taught from a very young age, things aren't always fair. You see kids who maybe have, nicer clothes than you. They have the newest sort of gadgets that you don't have. You ask your parents, can we get that? And they're like, no. We're taught from a young age that life isn't fair. But I feel like more recently, people are getting very good at making excuses. They're getting very good at complaining about their particular situation and their own injustices, which I can understand and I'm sure many people can sympathize with. But I think young people more generally who want to be successful, who want to start their own businesses, or even whatever route they go down, they need to take control of what they can actually affect. So, what would you say to young people in actually taking ownership and taking control of what they can do for their own success and for their own improvement?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's very easy to have an ego um, as a younger person, or actually as a person in a corporate job, because you ultimately, let's say you're working let's say you join a grad scheme, right? Your objective is to look as good as possible in the eyes of other people within that company. You know, that is doing the job to some extent, but it's also, you know, appearing that you're doing the job to some extent. Office politics is a thing. It is a thing in every company because ultimately it comes down to human relationships, right? And that's the same, the popularity contest that people have at high school where, everyone wants to be, the popular kid or the cool kid, whatever. Like, all of that ultimately comes down to the same thing, which is you want to be perceived in a certain way. And that's a very human experience. I'm not actually really dismissing it. I think it's so it's so universal that it would be silly for us to to dismiss it. It's just a fact of life because we grew up in tribes where your survival was dependent on being part of the in group, right? The difference between that and being a founder in particular is that you are working for you, right? And it doesn't serve you well to think that you or pretend that you're good at something if you're not good at it. So to kind of go, oh yeah, no, I'm very capable of running our company finances. I'm the best qualified person to be running our company finances because that's what a CEO does. Or, I should be doing X, Y, Z because, I'm actually really good at sales. It's if the belief is not actually true, or if it's just an ego thing, you need to get rid of it straight away. For me, to use an example from my own life, so number one, our finance and operations director Ollie Thorpe takes care of all of the finance stuff because that's not my forte. I'm better on the commercial side than I am on the finance side. I knew that already. That's not really an ego thing because I knew that. Where I have interestingly found uh, sort of a part of my ego that I had to unpick has been around productivity. So I'd always pride myself on being quite a hard worker. And actually, what I've realized since founding a company is I kind of prided myself on how long I was at a desk as opposed to how hard I was working. So I've really had to shift my focus from going, okay, working from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. if your productivity is not where it should be, is actually just nothing. That's a big corp behavior where you're like, oh, look how early I'm in and look at, how late I'm leaving. And so I've really had to kind of go, okay, well, actually, I need to be optimizing for productivity now. I need to work out where I need to be spending my time, what's really going to move the needle. And that's been quite an interesting shift because it's meant that I've had to reframe how I see myself, at a point of pride about myself, being like, oh, I've got a great work ethic. So, well, is it a great work ethic or is it just like quite a high tolerance for sitting at a desk for quite a long period of time? Um, and it's little things like that that I think you do have to address and you do have to get over quite quickly. It it because you stop suffering fools and you stop suffering corporate politics or stop putting up with it because you just need an outcome and you're optimizing for that outcome. Um, so I think that would be my kind of key piece of advice would be really reflect on where you're good and where you're shit. And be completely honest both with yourself and where appropriate with others about that because it's the only way to get better.
And what's the biggest challenge you faced?
Biggest challenge you face? I think I think for me at the moment I think it's work-life balance to a degree. The problem when you found a company is that inevitably it becomes an obsession. I don't know a single founder for which their business is not an obsession. And because it's so all consuming, and because you've only got so many hours in the day, it's very easy to end up inadvertently sacrificing other things, even things that are important to you. And because you are, you're hooked on the business, you're obsessing about the business, you can often overlook those things. So I think a lot at the moment about, the friendships that are really important to me, my relationship with my fiance. We've had a few weeks where we felt like we've hardly seen each other because I've been working late. And really, there was a recognition on my part that if you don't cultivate those relationships while you're also building a business, um, they will wither. And if they're important to you, then you need to make sure that you find time for them. And at the same time, it's harder and harder to relate to those people, if that makes sense, because you are on a completely different career path to them. I remember being at the pub the other day with a very successful entrepreneur who's actually in the co-working space that I'm in at the moment. Um, and we were talking about, so a friend of mine who's a lawyer, so very hardworking, had gone, I've had a really tough week, and had gone on to describe his week, which was a tough week by big corp standards, but was nothing compared to, a tough week at a startup. And I just remember thinking, like, we've got two completely different reference points for this now. And that's not like a smug thing to say. It's just you're on such a different road that it's very easy to kind of think, okay, well, I've got less and less in common with these people that are working at big corps. And that's you know, a real tough one to resolve, actually. Because your friendships change and evolve over time, but there are certain friendships where, I hope we'll be friends for life. And they're the ones that you really need to cultivate during this period, because they won't naturally understand what you're doing because they've never done it. Other entrepreneurs do. And, I've got some entrepreneurship or some, entrepreneur friends where, I won't respond to them for 6 days, and they will go, well, I know you were busy. If I didn't do that to some of my close friends who aren't entrepreneurs, they would find that very rude and very offensive, and understandably so. So I think that's I'm in that kind of tricky part of self-growth where the challenge is squaring these different parts of my life and this emerging part of my personality, and the experience that I'm living with the people that I care about and the friendships that I want to continue to cultivate. And that might sound a bit wishy-washy, but I think it's probably something that a lot of founders will recognize if they're listening to this podcast.
I mean, you mentioned having your startup is all consuming. And I mean, often the thing that happens is entrepreneurs can get stuck in a little bit of a vacuum. Your emotions get tied directly to everything that you're doing. If the startup has a bad day, you have a bad day. If the startup has a good day, you have a good day. I did
Correct.
want to ask though, because in that scenario, often you can get a little bit too emotional with the business, and that
Mm.
can lead to irrationality in decision making. What's been the biggest mistake you've made when running a startup, whether a decision or what have you? What's been the biggest mistake that you have made?
Biggest mistake that I've made in terms of building a business, very, very clear. And it's so stupid because I've now made it 3 times, so I can't make it again, which is not trusting your gut. And I had thought that gut feel was basically a load of rubbish, in the same way that, luck as a concept, sure, it exists, but it's, you create your own luck to a huge degree, or it's just completely random chance. Um, but anyway, I've 3 times with 3 separate suppliers, one on the wine side, but 2 just more kind of business services. There was something about them that made me uneasy, and they all spoke a really good game, and they all put, great proposals forwards. But there was just something about the way that they were acting that made me feel uncomfortable, made me think, okay, you know what, I probably shouldn't be working with this person. And 3 out of 3 times, it proved to be correct. And, luckily it was relatively limited damage, but still, several £1,000s a time, for a very poor outcome versus what was promised and what we were expecting. And I just had that sense that they wouldn't deliver. And the first time it happened, I thought, okay, you know, noted, but I hadn't really linked that sense. I was like, oh, I thought something was wrong there, but maybe I've thought that in other places that have gone under, with other suppliers that have gone on to be a great success for us. But now that it's happened 2 to 3, 2 more times, I now absolutely follow that gut sense, and I would rather miss out on a great opportunity that I didn't feel good about personally than risk, rolling the dice on someone that makes me feel like that, or a company that makes me feel like that. And that's a really weird one to articulate, but I think the fact that I made the same mistake 3 times, and by the third one, as I was making the decision, I was like, I think this is a mistake, but I thought, oh yeah, we'll just try one more time. And it's just, I don't know I don't know whether that makes sense, but I think that repeat, like, everyone makes one-off mistakes, but I think to have made the same mistake 3 times, um, yeah, really, you do have to kind of look at yourself at that point and go, okay, enough is enough now.
And you're always juggling probabilities when it comes to being an entrepreneur. You're making not necessarily big risks, but you're taking slight risks with every decision that you make. You did mention the importance of luck, however, which I want to go into further. What do you think the importance of luck is in an entrepreneur's journey, and how do you think young aspiring entrepreneurs can best place themselves to be ready to take an opportunity, whether it be by luck or what have you, when it's actually presented to them?
So I don't believe in luck at all. I believe in inputs, and I think that entrepreneurs like talking about luck because it allows them to shrug off, the slightly embarrassing idea that they've built something really amazing. But the luckiest people I know do the most stuff. So, the people that get luckiest with the investors that they end up meeting. So, there's everyone has stories about they meet the perfect angel investor for them. They get on like a house of fire. The guy agrees to take their entire seed round, whatever it might be, and he introduces them to all these fantastic people and is really kind of the cornerstone of this business in the early days. I guarantee you, the person telling that story had not spoken to 5 investors. He will have spoken to 150 investors or 500 investors. He'll have been going to networking events, or she'll have been going to networking events. They will have been doing serious reps. It's all about the inputs. It's the meetings that you have. In the same way, the luckiest salespeople that I know, the ones that have closed the biggest deals, I come from a sales background, which is why I use that analogy, overwhelmingly have the largest pipeline coverage. They make the most phone calls. They send the most emails. They've got the most deals in the pipeline. It is just about volume, and volume negates luck. That's a very Alex Hormozy phrase, but it is so true. There is no need. Of course, you might get lucky, and the first investor you speak to is the perfect angel for you, and you get on like a house on fire. But you haven't learned anything from that because you've just got lucky with that one conversation. Whereas real luck, like luck that you can actually control to any limited degree, is all related to inputs. So I think, if you roll the dice enough times, you will end up rolling a 6. And I think that that's the kind of key lesson that I definitely could have learned earlier, but I think a lot of young people could have learned earlier, because there is an expectation, particularly if you're an overachiever as a teenager or a kid, that this pattern of overachievement will continue. The real world is just not like academia. It's not like school. It's not like university. There are so many different paths you can take. It's so much more unstructured, so much less structured than your time at school and university is, that a lot of people get into that environment and expect to be rewarded or handed something, really, in the way that they were handed something at school. And that's not the case. So I think you just need to get used to taking action, working out the inputs, and you will get the outputs. It's just a matter of volume.
Thank you so much for your time today. We do actually have a closing tradition here on the podcast where we ask you if you could go back and give one piece of advice to your 16-year-old self, what would that piece of advice be?
What an amazing question. I think that, to use the kind of Tony Robbins type quote, I think the only path to success is to take massive determined action. I think I spent a long time inadvertently procrastinating, you know, reading around what I wanted to do rather than just doing it. And I was incredibly miserable during those years as a result, because it felt like I wasn't directionally correct. And I think my 16-year-old self could have saved himself a lot of pain, by just taking action earlier, you know, just getting the work done. So I think that, yeah, time to action it would be the key piece of advice that I'd give 16-year-old Callum. He wouldn't be listening to me at that age anyway, but certainly the advice I'd give him.
Thank you so much. It's been a huge honor talking to you today. I mean, your story is incredibly inspirational, and I'm sure one that's going to encourage a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs out there to take that leap and go and start that startup that they've always dreamed of. So thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.